There's a number that haunts the sleep of every economist, diplomat, and central banker who understands what it represents: $850 billion. That's roughly how much American debt China holds in its vaults. A figure so vast, it could fund entire national economies for years, rebuild infrastructure across continents, or disappear in an instant if the unthinkable happened. But this isn't just money. It's a chain binding two superpowers together in what might be history's most consequential financial embrace. A mutual dependence so deep that neither side can afford for it to break, yet neither can fully trust it will hold. The question isn't whether this system is stable. The question is what happens when stability itself becomes the thing we can no longer afford. To understand how we arrived at this precarious moment, we need to travel back to an August weekend in 1971, to Camp David, where President Richard Nixon made a decision that would reshape the entire architecture of global finance. For decades, the dollar had been anchored to gold, a promise that any holder of American currency could exchange it for precious metal at a fixed rate. Nixon severed that link in a single stroke, letting the dollar float free, backed by nothing more tangible than America's economic might and the world's willingness to believe in it. At the time, it seemed like a crisis management move, a way to stop the hemorrhaging of American gold reserves. But it created something far more profound, a world where the dollar's value rested purely on confidence, on trust, on the collective agreement that this piece of paper mattered because everyone agreed it mattered. 7 years later, on the other side of the Pacific, another transformation began. Deng Xiaoping opened China's economy to the world, launching what he called reform and opening up a cautious experiment in allowing market forces into a communist system. Chinese factories started producing goods for export, earning dollars, lots of them, and those dollars needed somewhere to go. The safest, most liquid place to park vast sums turned out to be United States Treasury securities, the bonds that fund American government operations. By the time China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, this pattern had become a structural feature of the global economy. China made things, America bought them, and the dollars flowed back to America in the form of loans to the government. A perfect circle, or so it seemed. This wasn't an accident. It was a choice, made deliberately by both sides, each for their own reasons. China wanted to keep its currency cheap relative to the dollar, making its exports irresistibly affordable to American consumers. Holding dollars, buying American debt, accomplished this goal while also building up foreign exchange reserves, a buffer against the kind of financial crisis that had devastated Asian economies in the late 90s. For the United States, Chinese appetite for treasury bonds meant cheap financing for government spending, low interest rates, and the ability to consume more than it produced without immediate consequences. Economists called it the exorbitant privilege of issuing the world's reserve currency. Both nations benefited. Both nations became dependent. There's a term from the Cold War that captures what this relationship became: mutually assured destruction. In the nuclear standoff between the United States and Soviet Union, neither side could attack without guaranteeing its own annihilation. The financial ties binding America and China created something similar. If China suddenly dumped its treasury holdings, it would crater the value of its own remaining bonds, destroy its largest export market, and destabilize the global economy on which its own prosperity depended. If America defaulted on its obligations to China, it would lose access to cheap financing, see borrowing costs explode, and shatter the confidence that keeps the entire dollar-based system functioning. The chain holding them together was forged from mutual vulnerability. Before World War I, a British journalist named Norman Angell wrote a book called The Great Illusion, arguing that modern economic interdependence had made war between major powers impossible because the costs would be catastrophic for everyone involved. European economies were deeply integrated through trade and finance, creating bonds that supposedly transcended national rivalries. For years after Angell's book became a bestseller apart in the most destructive war the world had yet seen, the illusion wasn't that war would be costly. The illusion was that cost alone would prevent it. Economic logic, it turned out, was fragile when confronted with nationalism, honor, fear, and the unpredictable cascades of crisis decision-making. The bonds between America and China are far deeper than those that failed to prevent 1914. But the lesson remains. Interdependence is not the same as peace. Think about the people whose lives rest on this system holding together: a soybean farmer in Iowa watching commodity prices that depend on Chinese demand. His retirement account filled with bonds and stocks whose value assumes global stability. A factory worker in Guangdong province, one of millions employed making goods for American consumers, her family's rise into the middle class predicated on export-led growth continuing. A retiree in Florida, living on a fixed income, dependent on Treasury yields staying stable and the dollar holding its purchasing power. None of them chose this interdependence. None of them can escape it. They're passengers on a vehicle they don't control, trusting that the drivers on both sides understand the stakes well enough not to swerve. But what if they do swerve? What if, instead of this carefully balanced system continuing indefinitely, something breaks it? To understand what that would mean, we first need to understand what default actually is, because the word carries different meanings depending on context and intent. In its simplest form, sovereign default means a government stops paying what it owes to creditors. But this straightforward definition conceals crucial distinctions. There's the default of inability, when a nation simply cannot pay because it lacks the resources. The kind of insolvency that struck Argentina repeatedly throughout its history, or Russia in 1998, after the ruble collapsed. Then there's selective default, choosing not to pay specific creditors while honoring obligations to others, a political decision about who deserves to be paid. And there's de facto default, the slow erosion of debt value through inflation or currency devaluation, paying back creditors with money worth far less than what they lent. The last type is often invisible to those not paying attention. A quiet theft spread across years instead of announced in a single dramatic moment. History offers precedents, cases where major powers chose or were forced to default, each with its own logic and consequences. In 1788, the French monarchy stood on the edge of bankruptcy, unable to service debts accumulated through wars and court extravagance. The attempt to solve the fiscal crisis by calling the Estates General set in motion the French Revolution, a complete overthrow of the political order. The debt disappeared, but so did the regime. Revolutionary Russia in 1918 repudiated all debts of the Tsarist government, declaring them illegitimate obligations of an overthrown system. This wasn't insolvency. It was ideological rejection, a statement that the new Soviet state bore no responsibility for what came before. Creditors had no recourse beyond diplomatic protests and the long freeze of the Soviet Union out of Western financial markets. Germany, after World War I, faced a different nightmare. The Treaty of Versailles imposed reparations so massive that even paying the interest became politically and economically unsustainable. As the Weimar Republic printed money to make payments, hyperinflation destroyed the currency's value, wiping out savings and creating the conditions for political radicalization. Eventually, the reparations regime collapsed, but not before contributing to social breakdown and the rise of extremism. Argentina's default in 2001 came from a different pattern, the endpoint of years of borrowing, spending, and promising reforms that never quite materialized. When the government finally froze bank accounts and stopped paying foreign creditors, it wasn't a surprise to those paying attention. It was the inevitable conclusion of an unsustainable trajectory, the moment when political will to impose austerity ran out. What separates these cases from what we're contemplating with the United States is fundamental. America borrows in its own currency. Argentina couldn't print dollars to pay dollar-denominated debts. Russia, in 1998, couldn't print the foreign currency it needed. The United States issues the currency in which it owes money, a seemingly magical ability to create what it needs to pay what it owes. This is why many economists argue American default is technically impossible, or at least irrational beyond comprehension. The government could always print more dollars, or more precisely, the Federal Reserve could purchase more Treasury bonds, monetizing the debt. The cost would be inflation, possibly severe inflation, but not outright default. For the United States to default wouldn't be a failure of capability. It would be a political choice, a decision to refuse payment despite having the technical means to pay. Americans have flirted with this choice before, though most don't realize it. In 1933, Franklin Roosevelt abrogated the gold clause in contracts, meaning debts that were supposed to be payable in gold would be paid in depreciated paper currency instead. Creditors lost substantial value. The Supreme Court upheld this decision, prioritizing economic emergency over contract sanctity. It was a soft default, a partial repudiation wrapped in legal technicality. More recently, the debt ceiling crises of 2011 and 2013 brought the country to the edge of technical default. Not because America couldn't pay, but because of political dysfunction. The refusal of Congress to authorize borrowing, even as spending continued, both times the crisis was resolved at the last possible moment. But both times revealed how close the world's most powerful economy could come to an entirely self-inflicted wound. Philosophers and political theorists have long grappled with the question of what makes debt legitimate. What obligates one party to honor agreements with another? Social contract theory, the idea that political legitimacy rests on implicit or explicit agreements between rulers and ruled, extends to international relations in interesting ways. If a debt was taken on by a dictator for purposes that didn't benefit the population, does a successor democratic government owe that debt? This is the doctrine of odious debt, rejected by most international law but appealing in moral logic. Extend this thinking further. If one generation takes on debt for spending that benefits itself but burdens future generations who never consented, is that debt legitimate? Democratic accountability becomes murky when decisions made decades ago constrain choices today. There's also the psychology of taboo violation to consider. Societies maintain stability partly through shared understandings of what's unthinkable, lines that won't be crossed. Daniel Kahneman explored normalcy bias, the way humans expect tomorrow to resemble today, making us terrible at imagining radical breaks with the past. The Overton window, the range of politically acceptable ideas, can shift gradually or suddenly, moving positions from unthinkable to policy in surprisingly short periods. American default on debt to China currently sits far outside that window for most policymakers. But windows shift, especially in crisis, especially when populations are frightened or angry, especially when demagogues make the previously unthinkable sound like common sense. So how might America cross that line? What pathways could lead from here to the moment of default? The scenarios aren't infinite, but several stand out as plausible enough to warrant serious thought. Imagine a scenario where China makes its long-discussed move on Taiwan, deploying military force to achieve reunification. The United States, bound by ambiguous commitments and strategic imperatives, intervenes. Within days, both nations are in a shooting war, one that neither can afford to lose. Economic warfare escalates alongside the military conflict. The United States freezes Chinese assets held in American banks and financial institutions. China retaliates by restricting rare earth exports, cutting off American companies from supply chains, and yes, threatening to dump treasury holdings. Markets panic. The conflict drags on, weeks becoming months, casualties mounting, neither side willing to back down without achieving objectives they've defined as vital. In this environment, domestic American politics becomes toxic. Cable news shows images of American casualties alongside graphics showing how much money flows to China in debt service. Populist voices, left and right, demand action. Why are we paying interest to a regime we're fighting? Why should American taxpayers fund the government attacking our forces? The political pressure builds, amplified by social media, by genuine outrage and manufactured rage alike. A congressional resolution passes, initially symbolic, declaring Chinese-held debt void due to state of conflict. The president faces an impossible choice: veto and appear weak, or sign and trigger financial catastrophe. Group polarization, the tendency for like-minded people to reinforce each other's views toward extremes, has done its work. The rally-round-the-flag effect, the surge of patriotic unity in wartime, provides political cover for what would be unthinkable in peace. And there's moral licensing at work. We're the defenders, they're the aggressors. So rules that normally bind us don't apply. The default happens, not despite the war, but because of it, as economic logic gives way to the deeper psychology of conflict. Or consider a different path, one that begins not with geopolitics, but with arithmetic. The demographic crisis everyone sees coming, but no one has solved: an aging population. Social Security and Medicare costs, consuming ever larger shares of federal budgets, interest on accumulated debt compounding. By some projections, within a decade or two, entitlement spending plus debt service could exceed total federal revenue, leaving nothing for defense, infrastructure, anything else. Congress, gridlocked by partisan dysfunction and ideological rigidity, proves incapable of raising taxes or cutting benefits at the scale needed. The can has been kicked down the road for so long that the road ends. In this fiscal death spiral, default becomes the least bad option in the minds of decision-makers. Not default on everything, they reason just on foreign creditors, just on China specifically. Domestic obligations, Social Security checks to American retirees, Medicare payments to American hospitals, these can continue if we stop sending money overseas. The political calculus is coldly clear. Seniors vote, bondholders don't, and Chinese bondholders certainly don't. Behavioral economics explains this perfectly through temporal discounting, the tendency to prioritize immediate and near-term concerns over distant future consequences. Politicians face election cycles measured in years, not decades. The immediate constituency, the voters who will decide their political survival, matters more than abstract international credibility or long-term financial architecture. Germany, after World War I, faced a version of this. Reparations became politically impossible to pay, not because the money didn't exist in some theoretical sense, but because extracting it from the German population was more politically costly than default. A third pathway looks different, emerging not from crisis, but from ideology. A fundamental reframing of what the relationship between government, economy, and society should be. Imagine a political coalition comes to power, perhaps after years of growing inequality, deindustrialization, and popular anger at globalization's costs. This movement questions the entire neoliberal consensus that's governed economic policy for decades. They ask, why should we prioritize bondholders over workers? Why is debt service sacred when infrastructure crumbles? Who benefits from dollar hegemony, and who pays its costs? Modern monetary theory, heterodox economics, arguing that sovereign currency issuers face no real budget constraint, provides intellectual framework. More pointed voices invoke Marxist critique of fictitious capital, the idea that finance capital extracts value without producing it. The movement gains strength, wins elections, takes power. Their default when it comes isn't presented as default at all. It's restructuring, it's reassertion of sovereignty, it's choosing people over bondholders. China's holdings are declared subject to renegotiation. Payment terms unilaterally altered, take it or leave it. The historical parallel is the 1930s, when nations across the world turned inward, embracing economic nationalism and autarky, rejecting the international economic order. That era ended in catastrophe, but the people who lived through it had their reasons, their grievances, their logic. The same could be true again. Finally, consider the possibility of accident. The scenario where default happens not through deliberate choice, but through cascading chaos. A sophisticated cyber attack targets the Treasury Department's payment systems. Blockchain technology adopted for efficiency proves vulnerable in ways no one anticipated. Artificial intelligence-driven trading algorithms, sensing instability, trigger massive sell-offs that overwhelm circuit breakers. In the confusion, payments are missed. Initially, it's meant to be temporary, a technical glitch. But as hours stretch 2 days, political actors on both sides face their own pressures. Admitting the payments will resume might look like weakness. Demanding immediate payment might trigger the very crisis everyone fears. The commitment escalation trap closes. The longer the standoff continues, the harder it becomes for either side to back down without appearing to have lost. Sunk cost fallacy means the costs already paid, political capital already spent, make compromise feel like wasted investment. This is the 1914 scenario. The sleepwalking into war thesis applied to financial crisis, how accidents become policy when no one can figure out how to de-escalate. Any of these pathways could lead to the moment itself, the actual default. So what happens in those first hours, days, weeks after the United States announces it will not honor its obligations to Chinese creditors? The financial contagion would be immediate and savage. United States Treasury securities have been considered the safest asset in the world, the foundation on which trillions of dollars in other investments rest. Banks hold them as capital reserves. Pension funds rely on them for stable returns. Foreign governments park reserves in them. Money market funds treat them as cash equivalents. If treasuries are suddenly not safe, if they can default, then nothing is safe. The treasury market would seize up instantly, no buyers willing to purchase new debt, Existing holders desperate to sell, but finding no bids. The dollar, paradoxically, might surge initially as global investors flee to it, despite everything. Simply because there's no alternative, deep and liquid enough, to absorb trillions in panicked flows. Or it might crash, confidence broken. As markets realize, the full faith on credit pledge means nothing if politics override it. Global stock markets would trigger circuit breakers. Automatic halts after declines reach preset thresholds, systems designed to prevent panic selling but overwhelmed by the scale of the event. Credit default swaps, insurance against default that major institutions sold, assuming they'd never pay out, would trigger simultaneously across thousands of contracts. Counterparty failures would cascade, firms that owe money to firms that owe money to other firms, discovering that chains of credit only work when every link holds. The 2008 financial crisis followed the collapse of Lehman Brothers, one institution. This would be the collapse of confidence in sovereign debt of the world's largest economy. The comparison to 1987's Black Monday or 2008's Lehman Weekend fails to capture the scope because those crises, as severe as they were, didn't undermine the entire foundation of global finance. Within the first week, the political scramble begins. The G7 holds emergency meetings. European and Japanese leaders trying to decide if they stand with the United States or condemn the default. The G20 convenes, emerging markets and developing nations, recognizing that if America can default selectively, everyone's debt becomes potentially suspect. China faces its own impossible choices: retaliate with sanctions, asset seizures, trade cutoffs that will hurt China's own economy, or focus on damage control, trying to stabilize what can be stabilized. The Chinese leadership has its own domestic audience, a population that will want to see consequences for American betrayal. Appearing weak could be politically fatal. In the United States, the reaction splits predictably along partisan lines, each side blaming the other. Unless the crisis is severe enough that political calculation itself breaks down, the Federal Reserve faces an impossible position. Its mandate includes financial stability, but supporting Treasury markets after selective default might exceed legal authority and create moral hazard. Does the Fed buy bonds the government has declared it won't honor? Does it provide liquidity to Chinese institutions? Every choice carries catastrophic trade-offs. The parallels to the 1933 bank holiday, when FDR closed all banks to prevent runs, or the 1971 Nixon shock weekend, when dollar-gold convertibility ended, provide templates for crisis management. But this would be larger, more complex, less containable. By the end of the first month, a new abnormal emerges. Countries have chosen sides or tried to stay neutral. Alternative payment systems, China's SIP system or bilateral currency swap arrangements, process transactions outside the dollar system. Capital controls appear as governments try to prevent money flight, wealth taxes, forced loans, bank deposit restrictions. All the emergency measures of financial crisis get implemented. Social unrest builds as pensions lose value. Retirement accounts evaporate, supply chains break down. The human stories are devastating. The factory worker who lost everything in a stock crash he didn't understand. The retiree whose carefully saved nest egg lost half its value overnight. The small business owner whose supply chain from China disappeared, leaving shelves empty. The comparison to post-World War I financial fragmentation, when currencies and trade flows split along political lines, or the 1930s competitive devaluations, becomes inescapable. But the immediate crisis, destructive as it would be, only opens the door to longer-term transformation. The real question is, what world emerges from the wreckage? For 7 decades, the United States dollar has been the world's reserve currency, the medium of international trade and store of value. This status conferred enormous advantages: the ability to borrow cheaply because everyone needs dollars, the ability to run sustained trade deficits because other countries will hold the resulting currency, the ability to impose sanctions that cut nations off from the global financial system. Economists call this exorbitant privilege the ability to print money that the rest of the world treats as valuable. Default would end it, maybe not immediately, but inevitably. What replaces dollar hegemony is uncertain. A multipolar currency system, where several currencies share reserve status, eliminates single-point risk, but creates coordination problems. The yuan could rise to challenge, backed by China's economic scale and patient long-term strategy, but would other nations trust Beijing's control over their savings? Digital currencies, whether central bank digital currencies or private alternatives, might offer new architecture, but their governance remains unsolved. Some voices would call for a return to gold or commodity-backed money, nostalgia for the certainty that supposedly existed before 1971. History suggests reserve currency transitions take decades. The pound sterling declining gradually across the 20th century, not disappearing in a day, but crises accelerate what would otherwise be gradual. The Trifin Dilemma. The contradiction between national monetary policy and global reserve currency responsibilities would be resolved the hard way. Global trade would fracture into blocks, U.S.-led and China-led economic spheres with different rules, different currencies, different standards. Europe would face an agonizing choice: depend on American security guarantees or Chinese economic opportunities, unable to maintain both. The Global South, developing nations that have played one power off against another for advantage, would find the room for maneuver narrowed as both blocs demand allegiance. Technology decoupling, already underway in semiconductors and telecommunications, would accelerate. Separate internets, separate supply chains, separate technical standards. The integration that took decades to build would unravel in years. The Cold War provides historical parallel, an economically divided world. But that division happened before deep integration. Splitting apart what's already woven together is more painful than never connecting in the first place. Behavioral economics explains the pain through loss aversion. Countries suffer more from losing existing trade ties than they'd benefit from theoretical new opportunities. The disruption costs come first and hurt immediately. The potential new equilibrium benefits, if they exist, arrive later and uncertain. Military and security ramifications follow economic breakdown with terrible logic. Does economic war become military war? Not necessarily, not automatically, but the pathway's open. Alliance systems reshuffle. What's NATO's purpose if the United States has defaulted on its obligations? Do Asian nations still trust American security guarantees when American financial guarantees proved worthless? Nuclear posture and deterrence calculations change when economic interdependence no longer constrains conflict. The 1930s pattern haunts economic nationalism, feeding militarism, autarky, enabling aggression, breakdown of international order, creating space for predatory behavior. Domestically, the political transformations might be equally profound. In the United States, isolationism resurgent, the old American temptation to withdraw from the world's problems. Or authoritarian crisis management, emergency powers invoked and never relinquished. The state controlling what the market can't. Or a New Deal for the 21st century, massive public investment financed by monetary expansion now that bond markets no longer constrain. In China, nationalist consolidation seems likely. The Communist Party using external threat to justify internal control, but internal blame for economic pain could destabilize the regime if growth collapses. Globally, the neoliberal consensus dies, the assumption that open markets and free trade benefit everyone. Economic nationalism returns as dominant ideology, each nation for itself. There would be winners and losers in this reorganization. Debtor nations, freed from their obligations if default becomes normalized, might celebrate liberation. Gold holders, commodity producers, anyone with real assets rather than financial claims might preserve or gain wealth. Countries outside both blocs, maintaining ties to each, could extract concessions for their alignment. But the global poor, dependent on aid and development finance that would collapse along with the international system, would suffer most. The human element, as always, matters more than the abstract categories, whose life improves when the world fractures and whose is destroyed. These scenarios assume some degree of management, of rational actors making calculated choices even in crisis. But there's a darker possibility, the runaway cascade where events escape control entirely. The derivatives market, complex financial instruments built on top of other financial instruments, involves notional values in the hundreds of trillions of dollars. These are leveraged positions, small price moves creating large gains or losses. Counterparty networks spanning the global financial system. If Treasury default triggers derivative payouts across multiple markets simultaneously, counterparty failures would cascade beyond any institution's or government's ability to contain. Too big to fail becomes too big to save when the entire system hemorrhages at once. The comparison to the 1929 to 1933 banking collapse, when thousands of banks failed and the money supply contracted by a third, doesn't capture the scale because the globalized financial system is far more tightly coupled, far more complex, far more vulnerable to cascading failure. Complexity theory teaches that tightly coupled systems produce normal accidents, failures that emerge from the interaction of components rather than from any single flaw. Social breakdown follows economic collapse with brutal inevitability. Mass unemployment, 30% or higher, not just people out of work, but purposeless. Entire industries disappeared overnight. Hyperinflation or deflation spirals, either the currency worthless or goods too expensive, debt burdens crushing, pension and retirement accounts wiped out, decades of careful saving gone. Elderly people facing poverty after lifetimes of responsibility, healthcare systems, food distribution, all the complex logistics of modern society failing as the financial glue holding them together dissolves. Weimar hyperinflation destroyed German savings and social trust. The Great Depression's global human toll ran to tens of millions unemployed, malnourished, desperate. Argentina's collapse in 2001 saw middle-class families scavenging garbage for food. Any of these precedents, all of these precedents, pale compared to what simultaneous collapse of the world's largest economy and global financial system could produce. Political radicalization breeds an economic apocalypse. When people lose everything, when the system that promised security and prosperity fails completely, they become receptive to extreme solutions, eager to find scapegoats, willing to embrace authoritarian leaders promising order. Minorities, immigrants, globalists, whoever can be blamed, face danger. Democratic norms and institutions erode under the pressure of desperate populations demanding someone fix things, willing to sacrifice freedom for security. The historical pattern is clear and terrifying. Hitler's rise from Weimar's ashes, the global fascist wave of the 1930s, how economic destruction creates political monsters. Carl Schmitt theorized the state of exception, how emergency suspends normal law, creating space for authoritarian power. Hannah Arendt traced totalitarianism's origins to the breakdown of social structures and individual atomization, conditions that economic catastrophe produces. The war question becomes existential in this scenario. Diversionary war theory suggests leaders facing domestic crises start foreign conflicts to unify populations against external enemies. Resource competition intensifies when economies collapse, food and energy security becoming paramount. Nuclear brinksmanship, the ultimate deterrent, operates differently when conventional economic deterrence has already failed. The 1930s produced militarism and aggression, but those nations lacked nuclear weapons. It's what happens when great powers face similar pressures, but with the ability to destroy civilization. Prospect theory. Daniel Kahneman's insight that people accept far greater risks to avoid losses than to achieve gains suggests that declining powers threatened with loss of status become dangerous in ways rising powers seeking gains are not. This is the nightmare scenario, speculative but grounded in historical pattern recognition. In how humans behave under stress and how complex systems fail, it doesn't have to happen this way. In fact, there are many reasons it probably won't. Start with institutional safeguards, the boring but crucial structures that prevent disaster. The Constitution doesn't clearly authorize selective default. Legal challenges would tie any such attempt in courts for years. The Federal Reserve, independent from direct political control, has tools to intervene, providing liquidity, supporting markets, acting as lender of last resort. The debt ceiling itself, source of so much political theater, isn't a hard constraint, but a political one, always raised eventually. International institutions, the IMF, World Bank, G7, G20, provide forums for coordination and pressure against unilateral action. History shows debt ceiling crises resolved at the last minute, repeatedly, suggesting institutions work even when they appear broken. The economic irrationality of default runs deeper. The United States borrows in its own currency, meaning it can always create the money to pay debts denominated in dollars. Default would be self-inflicted wound, America losing more than China, higher borrowing costs forever, loss of reserve currency privilege, destruction of the very financial system from which America benefits most. Alternative options always exist. Modest inflation to erode debt value. Financial repression, channeling savings into government bonds, even tax increases or spending cuts, all less destructive than default. Economic theory, the understanding that sovereign currency issuers face different constraints than households or businesses, suggests default is a dominated strategy, always worse than available alternatives. Political implausibility reinforces economic irrationality. What constituency benefits from default? Wall Street loses, pension funds lose. Foreign policy establishment loses credibility. Even populists would find their supporters suffering in the economic chaos. The coalition that could force default through doesn't exist. Cut across too many interest groups, face too much institutional resistance. China's limited enforcement mechanisms, inability to seize American assets or force payment, actually incentivize American restraint. The madman theory, the idea that appearing irrational gives negotiating leverage, has limits. Institutions constrain even erratic leaders. Status quo bias, the powerful human tendency to prefer existing arrangements over uncertain change, makes radical breaks extraordinarily difficult. Trillion-plus dollars in losses, immediate and certain, outweigh hypothetical leverage gains. Alternative uses of that leverage, negotiations over trade or technology or Taiwan, provide better returns than triggering financial crisis. Patient long-term strategy, the approach that's characterized Chinese foreign policy for decades, argues against precipitating catastrophe. Historical precedent supports this. Creditor nations rarely force major debtor defaults because the costs exceed benefits. Interwar debt, the money European nations owed America after World War I, was never repaid but never forced to default either, allowed to fade through negotiation and inflation. Behavioral economics explains Chinese reluctance through the endowment effect, the tendency to overvalue what we already possess. China values its existing treasury holdings, making willingness to force crisis that destroys their value unlikely. The mutual deterrence logic, financial mutually assured destruction, genuinely constrains both sides. Interdependence preserves peace when the costs of breaking it exceed any possible gain. This is the cautiously optimistic case. The liberal peace thesis that economic integration makes war unthinkable because prosperity depends on cooperation. Complex interdependence, the theory that multiple ties across multiple dimensions of relationship create stability, suggests the U.S.-China relationship has enough redundancy to survive shocks that would break simpler connections. Game theory models the interaction as iterated prisoner's dilemma, where reputation and future interactions make cooperation the rational choice even when single-round logic suggests defection. So, if default is unlikely, probably won't happen. What's the point of this thought experiment? What should we take from imagining the unthinkable? The first lesson is about fragility. Financial systems rest on confidence, on collective belief that commitments will be honored, that promises mean something. This confidence-based architecture is incredibly powerful, enabling levels of prosperity and complexity impossible under barter or commodity money. But it's also brittle, vulnerable to self-fulfilling panics, dependent on trust that can evaporate faster than it accumulates. Hyman Minsky understood this, theorizing that stability breeds instability, that long periods of calm encourage risk-taking that ultimately produces crisis. Economic models failed to predict 2008 because they assumed stability, rationality, continuous adjustment. They would fail to predict this crisis too because they can't model the political, psychological, social factors that override economic logic We operate under radical uncertainty, fundamental unknowability about the future, not merely calculable risk that can be hedged or insured. Karl Popper argued for the limits of prediction in complex social systems. Nassim Taleb built a career on black swans, high-impact, rare events that we're systematically blind to. The financial architecture we depend on is more fragile than we want to believe. The second lesson concerns the politics of sovereign debt. Debt is never purely economic, never just a contract between creditor and debtor. It's always political, embedded in power relationships, questions of legitimacy, democratic accountability versus creditor rights. When does debt become illegitimate? The odious debt doctrine says debts incurred by dictators for purposes that didn't benefit the population shouldn't bind successor governments. Extend that logic. Debt incurred by one generation for spending that benefits them, but burdens those who come after, who never consented. Is that fair? Democratic theory struggles with intergenerational questions. Every major default in history felt politically necessary to those who chose it. Justified by circumstances, defending populations against impossible burdens. The economic arguments against default are strong, but politics isn't economics. Who owes what to whom and why? The question has no purely technical answer. Geopolitically, we learn that interdependence can be weaponized. The same economic ties that supposedly make conflict too costly also create vulnerabilities that can be exploited. Strategic autonomy, the ability to withstand pressure from trading partners, trades off against efficiency gains from specialization and integration. The illusion is thinking economic relationships between rivals remain purely economic, insulated from geopolitical competition. Pre-World War I, Germany and Britain were major trading partners, deeply integrated economies. It didn't prevent war. It didn't even significantly slow the march to catastrophe. International relations theory divides between realism, which sees power competition as fundamental, and liberalism, which argues institutions and interdependence can transcend it. This scenario tests which view better predicts behavior in crisis. The pessimist in me suspects realism wins. The human costs of abstract finance deserve contemplation. When we discuss sovereign debt default, we're talking about abstractions, basis points, yield curves, credit ratings. But behind every basis point are people, ordinary individuals who become collateral damage in great power conflicts. The moral dimension of financial decisions at scale is easy to ignore because the causation feels indirect, the victims distant and numerous. Utilitarian ethics would weigh total welfare, asking whether default produces more good than harm. Deontological frameworks focus on duties and rights, whether debts create moral obligations, regardless of consequences. Either approach struggles with the scale. Psychology teaches us about psychic numbing, the way our moral intuitions fail to scale, our inability to grasp large-scale suffering meaningfully. We care about the identifiable individual, struggle to care about statistical thousands or millions. For individuals asking what this means for them, the answers are frustratingly limited. Diversification of assets, human capital, maybe even geography, provide some resilience. But individual preparation for systemic crisis has hard limits. You can't diversify away the foundation of the system itself: community resilience. Strong local networks that can provide support when large institutions fail might matter more than any portfolio allocation. Behavioral economics warns about the availability heuristic, our tendency to over-prepare for vivid scenarios while ignoring more likely but less dramatic risks. Obsessing over financial apocalypse while ignoring mundane dangers is poor resource allocation. Stoic philosophy offers useful framing through the dichotomy of control. Focus on what's in your hands, accept what isn't. We can control our responses, our choices, our preparation within limits. We can't control the global financial system. For policymakers, the implications run deeper. Gradual de-risking, reducing dangerous dependencies while maintaining beneficial trade, represents the cautious middle path. Debt sustainability and fiscal responsibility get reframed, not about arbitrary ratios or balanced budgets, but about maintaining the confidence that systems require to function. International institutional reform. Updating architectures designed for a different era might prevent crises that outdated structures can't handle. Scenario planning, wargaming the unthinkable, has value even for events we hope never occur. Policy windows, the brief moments when crisis enables change otherwise impossible, shouldn't be wasted. We learn or we don't, prepare or we don't. And crises reveal, which we chose. Ultimately, this thought experiment reveals something fundamental about the world we've built. We've created unprecedented prosperity through integration, lifting billions from poverty, enabling specialization and efficiency impossible in autarky. But we've also created unprecedented systemic risk, a globally connected financial system where failure anywhere can cascade everywhere. The paradox has no easy resolution. We can't undo integration without destroying prosperity. We can't maintain integration without accepting vulnerability. The soybean farmer in Iowa, the factory worker in Guangdong, the retiree in Florida, all of them still depend on this system holding. Their lives haven't changed since we began this exploration. The $850 billion in Chinese-held treasury securities still sits in vaults, still binds to powers together in uncomfortable embrace. The choice ahead isn't really between managed decoupling, continued integration, or catastrophic rupture. The choice is whether we acknowledge the fragility of what we've built, plan for contingencies we hope never occur, build resilience into systems designed for efficiency, or whether we continue assuming that because disaster hasn't happened, it won't happen, trusting in stability until the moment it disappears. Every era's economic architecture eventually ends, replaced by something new that solves problems the old system created while creating new problems for future generations to solve. Bretton Woods, the post-World War II system of fixed exchange rates and dollar-gold convertibility, lasted less than 3 decades. The current system of floating currencies and dollar hegemony has lasted 50 years. Nothing lasts forever. The question isn't whether this system eventually changes. The question is how. Gradually, through negotiation and careful adjustment, or catastrophically, through crisis and collapse. History suggests we don't choose these transitions consciously. They choose us, emerging from the interaction of countless decisions, unintended consequences, complex emergent properties that no designer intended. We create systems that develop lives of their own, behaviors and vulnerabilities their architects never imagined. The financial ties binding America and China emerged from rational choices by both sides, each pursuing its interests. Neither chose mutual assured destruction as a goal. They chose cheap financing and export-led growth. The destruction part, the mutual vulnerability, the systemic fragility, those were side effects. Externalities, emergent properties. So we don't know if default will happen. We don't know what triggers it might be, what path leads there, what world emerges after. We know only that the system is more fragile than it appears, that confidence is powerful but brittle, that interdependence can be strength or weakness depending on circumstances we can't predict. The final question isn't will default happen, but what are we willing to risk for the benefits we currently enjoy? How much vulnerability is acceptable for how much prosperity? When does efficiency become fragility? And when does security become poverty? There are no clean answers, no solutions that satisfy everyone, no paths that avoid all risks. There's only the choice to think clearly about trade-offs, to plan for contingencies, to build resilience where possible, to acknowledge what we can't control, and to hope that the systems we depend on prove stronger than they sometimes appear. The world we've built is remarkable, unprecedented in prosperity and complexity. It's also fragile in ways we prefer not to contemplate. This thought experiment asks us to contemplate anyway, to imagine the unthinkable. Not because it's likely, but because understanding its possibility changes how we see the present. $850 billion, a chain binding superpowers, a system resting on confidence, a world where tomorrow might not resemble today. We live in that world whether we acknowledge it or not. Better perhaps to acknowledge it